Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. This is a show organized by New Wine, New Wineskins, an association for early career moral theologians in a partnership with the Catholic Moral Theology blog. We strive to interview authors of books that are relevant to the field of moral theology. And today it's a great pleasure to have with me David Cloutier and Jana Bennett, the editors of Naming Our Sins, a recent book published by CUA Press. David joins us from Catholic University of America, where he's an ordinary professor of moral theology and ethics. And Jana Bennett joins us from the University of Dayton, where she serves as the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. This is an edited book. If you look at the table of contents, you can see a fantastic all-star team of colleagues, friends, moral theologians who are really making an impact in the life of the academy and of the broader church. And so it's a great pleasure to have the occasion to interview David and Jana. I'll start with a very general question. As the title suggests, you argue that there is a connection between helping people naming their sins and the work of moral theology. Yet, you also argue that this connection has in some way gotten lost over time. How did such a loss happen, and why do you think it's problematic?
So I would say that I think the loss happened in part because of what happened in the field of moral theology. Before the middle of the 20th century, all moral theologians were priests. And so thinking about moral theology went hand in hand with thinking about the confessional and specifically thinking about helping people name their sins. Though they did it in a very different way than David and I are advocating for in our book, a kind of updated version of what this looks like. So that's one of the big trajectories. I think the other trajectory is that in the second half of the 20th century, there is a decline in the way that people think about themselves as personally sinning. While I do think there are still Catholics out there who have a very developed sense of personal sin and are indeed eager to confess those sins, I think there's many, many more Catholics who have experienced confusion around the understanding of the confessional and think about sin as something that largely they don't feel like they do. And if they do, is it really something that they really have to confess? And so there's just so many different moving parts, but I would identify those two pieces as part of the issue.
Yes, and I would add, combining Jana's 2 points, the confessional practice in the church experienced a kind of crisis around and after Vatican II, in part because of people's own shifting understanding of sin and a dissatisfaction with the old form of confessional practice. And in many ways, that crisis was appropriate to the kind of renewal that the Council Fathers sought from moral theology. However, nothing ever replaced the old confessional or the old way of thinking about the confessional. People abandoned one practice, but it was not like some other form of the practice or some other form of naming sins became prominent. It was just a disappearance. And so I think part of what we hope to prompt with the book is a deeper reflection on how you can come to conceive the practice of the sacrament differently, even though it still retains obviously the same form or similar forms as before the council.
Let's focus for a moment on your reflections in the book on the sacrament of penance, of reconciliation. You mentioned in the book, and you were just reflecting on this, that there seems to be a divide between how theologians and clergy describe the sacraments of confession as being about the encounter with God's mercy, being about healing, being about reconciliation, and the popular imaginary of the confessional instead, that still very much shapes not only pop culture, but even many Catholics, especially some of the Catholics that do not make that part a regular part of their life in the church. Where does this clash of perspectives come from, and how do we overcome it?
Yeah, I had a student, very bright theology student at Mount St. Mary's where I used to teach. And I remember one time she said in a discussion, who wouldn't want a squeaky clean feeling? Who would want to walk around all dirty? And of course, what she was trying to explain was, who wouldn't want to go to confession? You get out of confession and you have a clean slate, and you feel clean. You should feel clean. And indeed, I think many people experience something like that when they come out of the confessional. So to me, part of the clash here is the process that the church asks from us for getting to the confessional in the first place. That if people could become squeaky clean and get a squeaky clean feeling without some of that process, they would probably do it. And so I think one of the big challenges is trying to help people see that self-examination of one's sins is not something that is psychologically damaging or pathological in any way, but indeed, to the contrary, is a part of a healthy and certainly holy life.
I think some of the difference too is we can see it very readily at the catechetical level. So, and I think you mentioned this in the book, that that children receiving the sacrament of reconciliation for the first time these days receive a very different kind of catechesis than their parents did. But at the same time, their parents are forming them into understanding confession in a very particular kind of way, which is a kind of older model. And I think that that's still the case, even though we're now, many decades out from the Second Vatican Council and from the shift in the particular shift in really identifying mercy in relation to the sacrament of reconciliation. And so I think, so for example, I think children are still very much taught to confess their sins as though it was a laundry list of things that they did. And there isn't a lot of post second grade or post first reconciliation, whatever age that happens. There's not a lot of additional catechesis that help build somebody or develop somebody towards like a more adult kind of understanding of confession. And so I think people just kind of limp along at the second grade level, but our faith is so much more than that. And so that's really one of the problems. And so I think some parishes have tried to deal with that by really trying to catechize parents as well. But it's very difficult because so many parents also have just, I've heard some of the stories, just atrocious stories about being in the confessional and being made to feel not a sense of mercy and forgiveness, but a sense of guilt and, just how utterly bad they are and like incapable, they feel incapable of receiving God's love, even though like that's the opposite of what the sacrament is supposed to impart. So, I think that's a real issue that's going on in today's church.
And I would just piggyback on Jana's comment to say that squeaky clean feeling happens maybe 90% of the time in my experience. Maybe that's slightly optimistic, but you're always subject to that 10% where you just don't have that experience, largely because of the clergy. presiding. And so if there are any clergy listening, I know most clergy take this with great seriousness and do it very well, but you need to do it well. It's a point when people feel vulnerable, and if you misfire in that situation, it can be very damaging to people's sense of the faith and the sacrament.
The two of you are mentioning so many of the topics that I'd like to explore further in our conversation. Before moving to some of them, still staying on the troubles that we have with the sacramental practice of confession, this is not just a matter for things that are happening within the church. The church is self-understanding, the church is catechesis. You mention in the book how there are also societal factors that play a role in making making it more difficult for us to understand the need for confession, what confession is, and so on and so forth. In particular, you mentioned a paradox that is a part of our society, namely that on our end, the very idea of sin has mostly dissolved. But on the other, we are constantly exposed to a rhetoric of condemnation, of guilt, of moral wrong. Could you unpack a little bit the origins and the effects of such a paradoxical situation, especially as they relate again to our understanding of sin, confession, and matters related to that?
Yeah, I think that there is a big paradox between what people encounter in secular culture compared with what people understand in the church. And one of them, this doesn't speak directly to your question, but one of the points that I would raise is that there's an interesting culture of confession. I think we get into this a little bit in the book, but I think several years on now, 5 years on, I would say, here's something that I would even go after a little bit more, is that there's this interesting culture of confession, which is a kind of fake confession, but that I think is like a kind of tell-all desire, a kind of, especially fueled by social media. So this kind of sense of, I just want to confess to a random audience I don't know all the secret bad things that I did. And then, other people will be doing the same thing. So it kind of normalizes the sense that like, hey, this isn't really bad. And it's actually not actually a sin. Like everybody does this, so no big deal. I think this goes along with what I mentioned a little bit ago earlier, which is that I think in the second half of the 20th century, we have a real movement toward a kind of I'm okay, you're okay kind of psychology of people understanding themselves as like, I'm not bad all the way through, which is how people understand sin and confession. And so in order to be able to say I'm not bad all the way through, they end up doing the thing of rejecting the whole idea of rejecting confession and the whole idea that they might sin. And so I think that's one of the things that's impacting the church. But it's a paradox because on one hand, like people are doing all this confessing, and on the other hand, they're rejecting sin. And those things kind of go hand in hand. I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at the question, but maybe David has more to offer.
Yeah, I think that's what Jana is saying is true. Gen Xers like us remember growing up with the kind of Donahue, Oprah, Maury Povich set of TV shows that were really about getting all kinds of ordinary people to be on TV. They wanted to be on TV, and what they had to do to be on TV was to talk about how bad they had been in their lives or display some kind of confession, right? And it had a certain cathartic value, but it was obviously not a context of mercy. I actually think, and we don't talk about this very much in the book, I actually think there's been a bit of a cultural shift in terms of the display, because I think people now want to present themselves as victims. perhaps this has always been the case at some level, but I think it's especially prominent in our culture today. And presenting yourself as a victim, even if you've done wrong things, right? But explaining the wrong things by presenting yourself as a victim. There's truth to it, but it is an easy way to avoid or evade the kind of responsibility that goes with the genuine confession of sin. And I don't think as a culture we've figured out how to reconcile, on the one hand, not wanting to blame the victim for all sorts of injustices, individual and social. But on the other hand, even as we don't do that, having people take responsibility for the roles that they've played in bad relationships, in certain kinds of lifestyles, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot of public denunciation is denunciation of others for victimizing me in some way. And that has it's condemnation, but it's not confession of sin.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that too that I think one of the difficulties with the impulse that David's pointing out is that you end up with a very, very wrong dichotomy between good and bad, right? The good people are the victims, the bad people are the victimizers, and it's very easy to name yourself as a victim, and very difficult to kind of bring the nuance there and say, you know what, I actually am a person who does bad things. I probably have victimized people, even if I also identify with this narrative of being a victim in particular kinds of situation. And then there's not that kind of opportunity for nuance. And so that too, I think, feeds into this, like, how can there be mercy when somebody's so bad, right? And that's a very strong narrative. And like the only kind of mercy you can show is to the victim. And it's a very troubling kind of way to think about it because we're human beings who sin, but we're not all bad. I mean, and that's definitely the Catholic tradition, very strongly so the Catholic tradition, but that just doesn't compete well in the marketplace of good versus bad. So.
Thank you. So the book is a collection of essays. Accordingly, each author brings to the conversation his or her particular formation, expertise, sensibility, style. Yet, it is a collection that is very coherent in sharing certain fundamental principles. One of them, which you actually emphasize in your introduction, is that one of the book's central claims is that we need to distinguish, disentangle, you use this word, the identification of sins and the idea of code violation. Why is that necessary, that disentangling? Isn't learning about and examining our consciences in light of a code of rules, a moral code, essential? How should we complement that practice, though?
So I think it's been a while since we drafted this chapter. That's the way book publishing works, right? I think I might have used the word code violation to try to name what we were doing there. And what I really mean is for us to think about the fact that, of course, in our lives there are explicit codes, and there are times when we violate those codes, and perhaps wrongly. And the boss might call us into the office, or the principal calls us into the office and says, you did this thing, the code says you're not supposed to do it, pay your fine or whatever. But there are the vast majority of behaviors that I engage in as an adult person are not negotiating whether I should follow or break a code that happens to be floating around my life. In fact, it has to do with all kinds of, you might say, trade-off choices, where I prioritize one thing over another, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, where I am inclined to choose something easy when something difficult looks like it might present difficulties, even though there might be a better payoff for it. And of course, things like loving your neighbor, practicing the preferential option for the poor, a whole variety of important rules in the Catholic moral life don't look like code violations, right? They always look like weird trade-offs, like I'm describing, where the sin is in your action. It really is in the action. It really is in taking a half an hour to read random baseball stories at this time of the year instead of doing my work during business hours. It's not a code violation at the end of the day, but it is a sin, I think, in the sense of not living up to the humanity and call to holiness that God calls me to. And so by trying to move away from code violations, we're not saying there aren't code violations and that's not a part of the confessional. It's that there's so much more to the moral life than just thinking about did I violate the code and how did I violate it?
I think what David says is exactly right. We weren't trying to dismiss the code violation. I think it for me it was a lot of it was about that piece of how do we help people move beyond that second grade kind of laundry list set of sins that, you know, my second grader who will go through first reconciliation this year already knows, like, I shouldn't hit my sisters. And I don't remember the last time she did that, but those are the kind of examples that are given, right? And the difficulty here is that sin is a lot more nefarious than that and a lot more nuanced, and it requires a kind of understanding of oneself on a spiritual journey. And like engage in an entire life devoted to God, which means a lot of complexity and a lot of, you know, we're gonna utterly miss the boat sometimes because we haven't paid enough attention to some of the things that surround the kind of trade-offs we've made. And that's one of the things we were trying to get our authors to pinpoint on these different deadly vices was, how do we begin to think about, I mean, for example, with gluttony, nobody thinks of themselves as like, I overeat. I mean, very few people actually think about that. But the great thing about that chapter is Haley talks about all the complex ways in which you can and should think about gluttony, which goes way beyond overeating. And so we begin to retrain how we understand sin and how we understand our place in that. And I think every author just did a really brilliant job of doing that kind of work.
At a certain point in the introduction, you put it really beautifully, I think, when you say that rather than having to confess specific, gravely wrong actions, we need to learn to confess in attentiveness to what matters, which I think is a description of what the two of you are reflecting about. Because you want to move our imagination and our understanding towards this inattentiveness, you organize the book, you and the authors organize the book around the deadly vices. Yet the way the Catholic tradition understands the very idea of vice is particular. It does not coincide with the way this word is used commonly. So I would really ask a simple question in a way: what is vice, and why did the tradition, and accordingly you and the authors, focus on them to discuss the reality of sin?
I'm sorry, Alessandro. I think I missed the second part of the question.
That's all right. So what is vice, and why did the tradition and even you and the authors decide to use the category of vice to reflect on sin.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the way I usually talk about vice to my students is I talk about it in terms of habits that we do that tend us away from the kind of path that the path toward God, the path toward the happy life that God gives us. That's, of course, contextualized in all kinds of other good moral theology that I would put in my class. But that's the basic way I describe it: is habits that move us away from God. And it's one thing to say that we are gluttonous once, and it's an entirely different thing to say that habitually we participate in the kind of diet culture that Theology talks about. Again, to go back to the gluttony chapter. Why did he choose the 7 deadly vices? I think we actually had some conversation about that. If I remember right, we could have gone with, there's multiple ways that Catholics have done examinations of conscience, the Beatitudes. I think our priest friends who write for us in the concluding chapters name some other kind of ways of thinking about it. But I think we just went with Thomas Aquinas and and kind of where we thought the fullness of the tradition was in terms of moral theology. And we also, when we were thinking about who to ask to write those chapters, for us it was actually pretty easy, it seems to me, in my recollection, like to match up the 7 deadly vices with different authors who had written on those things, and not necessarily on purpose, but just, Bill Madison writes on anger. Great, here's an anger chapter. So it ended up being maybe a kind of providential sort of ordering as well. But maybe David remembers more about that specific.
Well, it was in fact a great blessing that all 7 people that we originally asked all said yes, which anyone who edits collections knows that's difficult to do. We didn't ask unbusy people, but we're fortunate that we know so many good people, so many friends in the work that we do. Also, John Martino, the outstanding editor at CUA Press, who engaged us on this topic, I believe, threw out the suggestion of the 7 deadly sins as something that would draw attention to the book and be a nice way to get kind of between a purely academic audience that the university press usually aims at and a wider audience of Catholics. The way I explain or engage vice is to think about the fact that what it means for us to have vices is that these things are distortive of our nature. They're distortions of our nature. In the same way that virtues are a kind of second nature that build on what is natural and enhance, vices are the opposite. What they do is they take the kind of raw material that we present. Maybe that's not always the best metaphor, but it takes our nature and it distorts it somehow. So again, not to harp on the internet, since everybody will be watching this through the internet, but I, like many academics, have a highly developed sense of wanting to know things and think through things and gather more information for things. And I think it's part of why we like being academics. But the internet is like a great medium for distorting that way of naturally being human, right? That there are certain ways in which that development, that thirst for knowledge, that thirst for wisdom can be built on, but too often, not always, but too often, the internet turns out to be a kind of distortion, right? So the distraction of the internet, or the fact that the information is packaged in a certain way, is a distortion. So I think that this idea that the device is a distortion of our nature, a distortion of certain kinds of inclinations that could be good and indeed enhanced is really crucial.
So if you have to describe your vices, if you have to name your sins, you need to use language. And you reflect on the importance of language and descriptions in the task of the life of faith, and then also in the task of moral theology more broadly. So could you help us reflect a bit on the importance of language and descriptions in the moral life?
Well, as we say in the introduction, everything we do, we at least implicitly describe to ourselves. So if somebody asks us the question, "What are you doing?" We are usually able to offer a description, not just of the physical motions that we're doing, but of what we're doing with a kind of intention that describes, why am I spending time on an interview for the blog, or why am I spending time on this or that? But those descriptions are versatile. We have amazing abilities to redescribe what we're doing in certain kinds of ways that might shield the problems with what we're doing. And so attending to this description, trying to get the description right, it seems to me is very important. One of my other books focuses on the vice of luxury, and I think things related to overconsumption or desiring certain goods inordinately is something that we've redescribed in our minds as okay or a treat, or we have various shopping therapy. We have various ways of describing it, but it turns out what it really is what the ancients called luxury. So that act description is always going on.
And I guess I would just add that I think being able to describe what you're doing truthfully is probably, 90%, maybe even higher of the task of the moral life in a certain kind of way, because the what you can envision doing in a particular, like what I can envision doing right now with the two of you on my screen and in this office, and the kind of actions and interaction that I can envision having with you, and whether those are good or evil, or vice-driven, and that kind of thing. That's all kind of shaped by what my vision of the world is, and if I understand it in a way that is primarily not truthful, then I think I'm gonna be pulled much more into viceful action, even without necessarily intending it. And so I think the real task of moral theology is really to I guess, could I put it this way? I mean, to really encourage people to be much more open and creative about their vision, and kind of understanding that in relation to the life of God as they understand it in the scripture and tradition and sacrament. And so it's just vital, like how you describe things is just vital to the whole practice.
Yeah, and perhaps I could come up with a little bit more serious example of this in our society. We are all deeply aware of racial injustices, environmental injustices, economic injustices that go on constantly, are baked into the structures that we all inhabit. And there is a desire, I think, on the part of most good Catholics of goodwill, and many people who are not Catholic of goodwill, to do something about these problems, to act against these problems. But what I think one of the big challenges that we face now, because there is a very high awareness of this, is how to differentiate between actions that really address the problem and virtue signaling. So I was on the anti-racism committee for our university, and I have to say that one of the challenges within that group was that the university wanted to do certain things that showed that it was anti-racist and was against things, but would it actually make things better for the students of color who were actually on our campus and what they were telling us about their experiences at the Catholic University of America? Well, I mean, so some of the stuff that was proposed was virtue signaling. That's the description that we have of it. And so asking ourselves, am I really doing the thing that will fight the injustice that I'm concerned about? Or am I just trying to signal to people that we're doing things, but they don't actually address the challenges that people really need addressed?
So this gives me an opportunity to ask another important question as we try to name truthfully what's happening in our moral lives. We come to terms with the fact that while sin has certainly something to do with our individual will and our individual choices, it also has to do with the injustices that go beyond the individual. The Catholic Church names them structures of sin and so on and so forth. Could you help us unpack the complex relationship between individual and social sins, or between the person and the structures of sin in which we all need to navigate?
Do you want to say something? So I guess
Sure. I'll say something just brief,
yeah.
because I think I'm up. But the relationship is very complicated, and we asked every author in this book to make sure that when they were talking about naming sins, that they thought very, very intentionally about social problems and the ability to tie certain larger social problems to the particular vices that we were talking about, that the author was talking about, so that people didn't simply take those larger social problems and not identify ways in which they were contributing perhaps to perpetuating something, or were inadvertently buying into some kind of pattern in the society. Really connect the individual and the social, which I still think is the most important thing, is to recognize we have to be environmentally virtuous individuals, and we have to have laws and regulations that orient the economy towards environmental practices. But we cannot succeed without both things. And recognizing that in the confessional, we're not going to be talking about policy. We're going to be talking about individual things that play into policy or relate to certain kinds of rhetoric in society, and asking ourselves what our responsibility is in relation.
I would add, and this is, I think, nowhere in the book, but it's certainly something I've thought about a lot, which is, I think one of the ways that I think about systemic sin, and the way that I try to help people think about the difference between their individual actions and systemic sin, is by thinking about and reclaiming the understanding of original sin, which I think so many people tend not to like as a term for a variety of reasons. And one of the ways that I talk about original sin is by thinking about that sin as we're caught up in a world that is not of our own making. We're caught up in, we're born into this world, and it gives us all the stuff of the hubris of human life, and we're already in it. And there's no way to escape that. There's not a pristine something. And so, like, all of those things are already shaping us, informing us in ways that can be viceful. as well as full of virtue. And so this is the part of, so the tricky thing is that we're always already born into this world that we're just kind of, that we are given. And we recognize it as both a gift and also that it's a troubled world, that this is not a thing that, there's not a kind of ideal world there that is behind the, if we could just, I guess, cut through all the stuff, that we would somehow have the ideal world. And so that's the part of the difficulty, is that we are developing on a faith journey towards God, which means, I think, deeply living, trying to deeply articulate and live a moral life. And also at the same time articulating how we are seeing the world. And ideally, I think this goes back to the vision piece from the last question, right? Ideally, what we're beginning to try to understand throughout our whole lives is, how does the vision that the world presents end up providing something that is not at all what God's vision, God's plan is. And so that constant kind of adjusting, that constant kind of thinking through God's plan and God's sense of justice enables us to kind of participate in and want to do something with that, even as at the same time we're also trying to grow and develop from a personal sense. But we Catholics do not believe that we're all. I think that I think this is true. Like we're not all like alone on this salvation or not kind of thing. We're kind of in this arc together, right? And so I think that's part of what we're understanding about what it means to be a creature, God's creature, that we've got that work to do together.
So I know that asking this question is like asking parents to decide on their favorite child. But was there an essay or some considerations of your authors that made an impact in how you understand that particular scene, or just a moral theology concern more broadly, that have kind of stayed with you? Again, the quality of the essay is spectacular. They're all really beautiful. But again, is there something that has resonated and that stayed with you over the years, maybe in your teaching or in other parts of your scholarship?
I feel like, okay, I'm just going to say I don't feel like I can walk into this one. The way I would put it is this: I think I learned so much from each of my colleagues' writing, and I think the essays kind of stick with me in different ways at different times. Probably relative to the kind of sin I might or might not be getting into at that moment. I think of every single essay, and I think of things like, reading Bill Madison's essay on anger. I can definitely think about like times like thinking about righteous anger and that kind of thing. I've already mentioned Beth Haley's piece several times. Dana Dolan's piece on envy, like, really kind of hit the mark. And for academics, oh my goodness, right? It's just so I really think all of them. Jason's on Lust, and they're just all. And then the great thing to me about each of these contributors is just how much they're themselves, and also how much they said things that complemented each other. So I just feel like the volume really came together in just such an amazing way. And I feel really, really glad to be part of that project with them. So I think that's about as good as I'm going to get in terms of naming anybody.
Yeah, what Jana said is all very true. When we were editing the essays, I was kind of blown away by how high quality the thing turned out, and how well the essays complemented one another, how they were all distinctive, but how they formed a unity of vision that I thought was really good, even though people were coming from different places. There were kind of two things that sprung into my mind just because it was like, oh, this is fresh. Is Jason King has a great three-pronged distinction when he's talking about the vice of lust. He distinguishes three kinds of lust. I think that's really a really helpful tool. Obviously, I teach marriage and family undergraduate classes, and so thinking about what kinds of tools help people get a more sophisticated understanding of how their sexuality is getting distorted, I think is really important. There's not just one form of lust or something. There are these different forms, and Beth Haley does something similar with gluttony. The other thing that I will mention is Julie Hanlon Rubio's essay on sloth. We picked Julie in part because she is such an indefatigable scholar. I mean, her productivity is incredible, and she has all kinds of projects that are going on the side, both at St. Louis University and where she is now at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. And so she really grappled well with the idea that sloth and busyness could be together in life. And thought about numerous constructive ways in which people who are busy may still be subject to the vice of sloth, and that it's not simply you're lying around like a couch potato. So those are the two that struck me particularly, but they're all great, of course.
Thank you. Yes, as we enter the last part of our conversation, I want to ask you a couple of questions that link the work and vision of the book with some more contemporary questions and challenges we live in the church. The first one is one that you mention in the book, and it has to do with Pope Francis's pontificate and ministry, and even his way of leading the church and teaching about the church's tradition. You mentioned how in Pope Francis we see these two emphases. On the one hand, the emphasis on mercy, on moving beyond a certain judgmentalism, his rhetoric against the doctors of the law. But on the other, there is an acute insistence on the reality of sin. He publicly goes to confession. When he was asked in his first interview, "Who are you?" he started from, "I'm a sinner forgiven by the Lord." So again, some people in the disagreements that happen in the church want to have a hard time reconciling these two facets of Pope Francis's ministry and witness. So how do you think about these two facets of his life and ministry, and how what you have learned with this book help you think about those?
So one of the finalists in considering cover photos was a photo of Pope Francis himself confessing his sins, kneeling back, but you could tell it was Pope Francis, right? Actually confessing his sins, because in a way that encapsulates the whole message of Francis's papacy, a kind of humility and an openness to God's mercy that requires things like confessing your sins, even if you're the Pope. And doing it in a way that lets yourself be photographed doing it. And I think that the resolution of this in the Francis pontificate is still unclear. I myself, in reading Francis, don't have difficulty seeing, on the one hand, the strong emphasis on God's mercy and the field hospital, and on the other hand, a strong emphasis on holiness and an accountability for sinfulness, although he may understand sinfulness in some different ways, right? Like doctors of the law. So I can see both of those things going on, but the Francis is a figure in a larger ecclesial power struggle. Sadly, I think it's a power struggle. And the power struggle has been going on for a long time before Francis, and unfortunately, the papacy then becomes part of the power struggle, quite unintentionally, I think. But like I said, I think the book wants to emphasize, and I would certainly emphasize, that the humility, Francis, and the take responsibility for your sins and bring yourself to God's mercy, Francis, are both clearly on display.
I agree with what David said, and one of the things that came to mind as he was talking was the parable of the debtors, and I wonder if some of that is going on here in Pope Francis's mind, the sense of, you know, that one can be a really great debtor to the king and owe a whole lot, and, you know, be about to be thrown in prison and yet be forgiving, and then turn around and not do likewise for the person who is, you know, your neighbor, and then that just incurs even more wrath from the king, rather than, I mean, like that there's this kind of, there is this connection in that parable between the great mercy and forgiveness that we receive, I think, from God, but also from the priest speaking in persona Christi, and also then the kind of mercy and forgiveness that we ourselves show. And there's that connection there. And maybe we just, I guess that's what came to mind. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The other way in which the book speaks to some contemporary issues that have emerged is that the book steers clear of a lot of methodological thinking and debating and fighting. Again, this is not part of the book's project. Part of it, I'm sure, it's having to choose. You cannot talk about everything and so on and so forth. But it does seem that there's something more profound than that. There seems to be a commitment in you and the authors to practice moral theology in a way that moves moral theology beyond these intra-academic debates and fights about methodology. I mentioned that just because such fights flare up every once in a while, and recently they have flared up again because of some conversations that are happening at the Pontifical Academy of Life. So again, could you reflect on the fact that, again, you steer away clear of the methodological fights in this work? You could have picked them, obviously, but you didn't.
Yes, I think that's very true. Both for me and David, as well as for all of the authors. I think we have a shared commitment not to speak to each other only along the kind of ideological lines that exist, especially in my experience in U.S. Catholic moral circles. And I think the people who are authors in the book might identify with one or the other kind of group that might seem ideological to outsiders. But I think, you know, one of the things that made this group work so well is that we've all been part of the Catholic Moral Theology blog together in various ways and times since it started in 2011, and came to that blog with that sense of wanting to have those conversations. And so there was a way in which this book was just an outgrowth of the continued conversation. And you know, we knew that whatever was the case, that we shared a sense that that the central question about sin and the central question about how to follow God, that those were things that we held in common, and as a really key concern in doing moral theology, and I think that brought us together. So yeah, I think without that kind of shared sense, I don't think the book would exist.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my colleague John Grabowski came up to me when the book came out and said, "Is this old wineskins?" And the joke he was making was how generative New Wine, New Wineskins, which started in 2002, was of a kind of way of talking among scholars of that generation in particular, who are represented in this collection, that really did avoid, I mean, avoid is probably the bad word, focus on other kinds of things that enabled a wide variety of people who might even have disagreements on certain fundamental contested moral issues to still talk together about how to live out the Christian life and the Christian vocation, which people want to take seriously across the spectrum on some of these church dividing questions or church fissuring questions. So I think the New Wineskins and then the blog following out of New Wineskins was really crucial to saying, yeah, we want to cultivate a way of speaking that doesn't just reinforce these paradigms. The other thing I would add to what Jana said is it's not a coincidence that both Jana and I graduated from Duke at a certain time. And there is a way in which the kind of Duke cohort, which is not everybody who wrote the book, I'm not trying to make Stanley Hauerwas responsible for the collection, but so many of the Catholics who came out of Duke went to Duke because they wanted a different kind of way of thinking about the Christian moral life that was serious about discipleship, but that was not engaged in some of these kind of, white-knuckled battles over really specific questions or really specific methodological claims. I think that is also animating this book, and hopefully a spirit that we keep alive in the field, because I do think if everything comes down to these particular contested questions or methodological things, we'll just miss so much in terms of helping people actually follow Christ, which is ultimately the purpose here.
The spirit is alive and well, considering that I stand here as a board member of New Wineskins that can testify to the ongoing presence of that way of being with each other and dialogue with each other. So let us certainly hope that this experience continues. One final question. I think one of the most beautiful aspects of the book is that it speaks to a variety of audiences. It speaks to fellow moral theologians, it speaks to students, it speaks to clergy, but it can also speak to just the laity, lay folks who are interested in learning more about how to think about their moral lives. So I want to conclude with a question about that. You speak about the fact that confession requires a sort of spiritual maturity, a mature life of discipleship. What are some of the practices that can help us enter into that more mature life of discipleship that the book wants to encourage us to enter into?
There are many ways that one could answer that question, and the cultivating this mature sense of sinfulness is something that Jana and I and some others have actually been having conversations about recently. What does a mature sense of sinfulness look like, and how does it come about? I'll just mention one thing that I think is important, but that there are obviously many things, is a deep thankfulness or gratitude for God's merciful action in one's own life, and of course in Christ and all of the events of Scripture, but a vivid sense of how it sounds trivial to say how much God loves us, but a vivid sense of what specifically God has done for us that is amazing, overwhelming, that gives us a sense of awe, that then leads to a sense of gratitude, that in light of this, we can come to reflect on our sinfulness. Bishop Robert Barron has a nice image in his book, The Strangest Way, where he talks about sin being something that shows up like a dirty windshield in a Chicago winter, when suddenly you shine light on the windshield and the windshield goes opaque and you can only see how dirty the windshield is from all of the salt and everything. But you can only see the dirt, sin, really well in with the light shining on the windshield. And so being grateful to God's intentional activity for us, I think, can deepen our sense of sinfulness in a mature way.
I think I'll just add what I think is a complementary practice to what David suggests, which is one that I've been reflecting on a lot over the past 5 years or so, but the importance of contemplation and a practice of contemplation for doing moral theology, which is not what we are trained to think of, I think, but contemplating Christ on the cross, contemplating the risen Christ, any number of aspects of contemplation, but that invite us into God's own story of love that enables us to then reflect on and think about how do I be the person God wants? How do I be more the person God wants me to be? How do I respond to my neighbor more in the way that God wants me to respond? I think that would go a long way toward that. And what's more is, I think, contemplation is so needed in a world that really has forgotten how to do that at all. So.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you, David. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm deeply appreciative and grateful for your time and availability today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alessandro, for organizing it.
Thank you, Alessandro.
I look forward to continuing the conversation online at the Catholic Moral Theology blog. And for all of those of you who are watching, see you again in 2 weeks for another episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. Thank you and be well.
Thank you.